Come on, we gotta go.
It's time to show everyone we're more than meets the eye. Transformers 1 is here, and so is the origin story of these iconic action figures / characters. And today we're ranking the cast of Transformers 1 from good to evil. Without further ado, let's speed on over to the most admirable and noble characters, and work our way down to the most evil. These characters are the good. And honestly, this may not even be fair, but we just have to give the gold medal of good to Primus, who is basically the god of the Transformers universe.
Holy Primus.
Within the first couple minutes of the film, we see a retelling of their home planet's origin, wanting to protect its people and give them a safe home. Primus did the only thing you could do in that situation and turned himself into a planet. We've all been there before, right? Such a noble sacrifice basically makes him worthy of the top spot by default, even if he doesn't really do much directly in the film. But what really gets him boosted up to the top is his protection of the Matrix of Leadership. When Sentinel Prime, who, spoilers, we'll be getting to a lot later on this list, betrays his fellow Primes to try and take the Matrix for himself, Primus decides that it would literally be better to straight up Thanos the Matrix out of existence than to let someone like Sentinel have hold of its power. Everything Primus did was for the good of all the Cybertron, which makes him a pretty easy choice for the gold medal of good. Not too much lower, however, we have the chosen wielder of the Matrix, Orion Pax, later known as Optimus Prime. At first, Orion Pax might seem like the most reckless of the main duo, and while that is true, it actually plays into him being a much more heroic person. He does take a lot of risks throughout the movie, from entering himself in D16 into the Icon race without the latter's consent.
It's time to show him we are more than meets the eye.
To ultimately leading the gang on a dangerous quest to find the Matrix of Leadership, thus ending the Minorbot's endless loop of mining for Energon. But with all that said, Orion still works harder than pretty much anyone else to create positive social change, never losing hope no matter how bleak a situation seems. His best trait, though, is definitely his protectiveness. You can see throughout the entire movie that Pax is constantly putting others above himself, from rescuing Jazz from an exploding cave against his captain's orders, to single-handedly, literally, protecting B-127 from getting killed by that gigantic sentry ship.
Oh, thank you.
It all culminates in the final act scene where he takes a blast to protect Sentinel from being executed by D-16, nearly killing himself for the sake of saving one of the absolute scummiest characters in the film. If there's any deed that makes you worthy of becoming Robot Jesus himself, it's that. Taking the bronze medal of evil is a character you might have forgotten, but personally, we here at Wicked Binge will never forget Steve and the sacrifices he made for robot kind. When B-16 and Orion are sent down to sublevel 50 as a punishment, they meet B-127 and his friends, including Steve, whose accidental death at the hands of Orion reveals that he was holding a long-lost message from Alpha Trion. Without Steve, you might say they would have never found the Matrix of Leadership. That's truly an impressive record for him, although his inability to even be alive earns him the Sloth Sinner medal pretty easily. Following Steve is his longtime friend and one-time accidental killer, B-127, also known as Bumblebee / Badassatron.
Which is actually pronounced Badassatron.
In all honesty, even without being too familiar with Transformers myself, I always knew this guy was my favorite. He's just such a lovable goof. For his general clumsiness and recklessness, we give him the Darwin Sinner medal. But don't be fooled by that, because he is truly a ride-or-die companion. He wastes no time befriending Orion and D-16, helping them escape to the surface to find the Matrix of Leadership, all of that for a couple people he just met. He also befriends Elita pretty quickly, which is even more impressive given just how mean she can be. Really, B is very much a donkey from Shrek-coded character.
Really?
The worst he'll do is make a rash decision here and there, or maybe talk a little too much. It never comes with any ill intentions, though. If we had to say anything bad about him, it's that he does take a little too much pleasure in his new knife hands.
Wait, no, it was already like that, right?
Yeah, that's right. It was already like, yeah.
But, come on. Can you really blame him? And rounding out the undeniable good guys, we have Alpha Trion. Trion here is the one who left that essential message to Steve, the MVP of the movie, so for that alone, he naturally earns quite a few brownie points. When Orion and the gang revive him, he directly reveals the truth about Sentinel to them, which kickstarts the second act of the movie and ultimately helps them restore peace to Cybertron. It also keeps them from having to mine for all of eternity, which I'm sure was a nice perk. He's also the one who gave them their transformation cogs, turning them into the more marketable, recognizable versions of themselves. Add to the fact that he's a legit war hero, and you've got a character perfect to round out our good section. But it's time to venture into the more questionable characters. This is the moral gray area. And this might be a divisive entry, but we've decided to give former captain, now commander, Elita-One, a spot in the gray section. This isn't to say that she's some corrupt character or anything, though. It's just that she's more self-serving than others. For one, her best idea of a pep talk is telling Orion that she's better than him in literally every aspect except for hope. That mindset alone earns her the Pride Sinner Medal, for one thing. And it adds on to the fact that her whole motivation for everything she does throughout the movie is to get promoted. She's even willing to let Jazz die in a collapsing mine rather than get herself fired, which is a pretty scummy choice. But I guess you could potentially argue that's more like Cybertron's sin rather than hers. She's a very punch first, ask questions later kind of character, which is actually how she gets Soundwave and his allies to join the battle against Sentinel. Still, Elita is ultimately on the side of good. She stays by Optimus Prime's side like Bumblebee after Megatron is banished, and proves herself to be a worthy ally who wants to make a better future for the people around her. She's more of a neutral character, but despite her flaws, Elita is definitely a decent person overall. Moving on to Starscream, leader of the Vigilantes trying to take down Sentinel Prime from the shadows. Knowing what we know now about Sentinel, that might sound like a good thing to do, but then there's Starscream's methods to take into account. After capturing Orion Pax and friends, Starscream literally offers to either slowly, torturously kill them, or to quickly kill them in exchange for information about Sentinel Prime. So yeah, being cool with torture under most circumstances is basically a surefire ticket to get yourself to the gray area. But if nothing else, he did work to inspire a lot of other robots who'd been affected by Sentinel's greed. It's gonna take a lot more screen time to really understand this dude's morals, but he is really one of those characters who could lean either way in the end. And although with much less screen time, we have to give Soundwave and Shockwave a quick mention. Seemingly two of Starscream's most powerful baddies, they ultimately helped to save their leader and friends from Sentinel. That's a pretty good deed, sure, but we can't ignore that it was mostly done out of fear that Elita would hit them again. They definitely seem like the type to just team up with whoever seems most likely to win, which makes their loyalty doubtful at best. But they technically helped out, and they aren't exactly scheming for world domination or anything, so I guess that's kinda good. I'm really digging for scrap metal here, guys. Finally, we get to our last category. We now enter the bad and evil section, and first up is the only one in the category who isn't a full-on villain, Darkwing. There is a lot of corruption going on in Cybertron, and that paves the way for plenty of bullies like Darkwing to gain high positions of power. Darkwing is the kind of guy who will take literally any opportunity to punish people beneath him as brutally as possible. From firing Elita for one single mistake that wasn't even her fault, mind you, to sending multiple Autobots down to sub-level 50 to basically engage in slave labor, which, considering how most of the minor bots were already engaging in slave labor, basically means he was downgrading them to advanced slave labor. The only reason he isn't any lower is the simple fact that despite being a jerk with no redeeming qualities, he's not a full-on villain. I don't doubt that he would be if given the chance, but hopefully getting smashed by an arcade machine taught him a valuable lesson. Landing just outside the bottom three, we have D16, tragically known later as Megatron, the series' most iconic villain. But to his credit, Megatron is the final villain on the list who has anything adjacent to an empathetic origin story. He was initially Orion's best friend and the voice of reason in their relationship, and the two would stick together through anything and everything.
Lovely.
Once it was revealed that Sentinel Prime was a traitor, however, Megatron, understandably I might add, grew delusional with his entire life, realizing everything he did was for the sake of a gluttonous, power-hungry monster. This led D16 down a slow but steady road towards villainy, a road we call Violence Road, and a road that earns him the Wrath Sinner Medal. D16 resorts to violence as quickly as possible with antagonists, more than willing to crush anyone and everyone who gets in his way. Even accidentally shooting his own best friend, nearly killing him instantly, doesn't snap him out of it. And as Megatron is fully willing to let Optimus fall to his death, he reveals that he's already made up his mind about how he wants to use his power. It's a tragic story of corruption and a classic example of that old phrase, hurt people hurt people. Unfortunately, Megatron went from understanding that as people who've been hurt will hurt others to, God, I love hurting people who hurt me. And that's led to him inching closer to the very thing he wanted to take down. The Bronze Medal of Evil goes to Sentinel's right-hand lady, Arachnid. Compared to her commander, we don't really get a lot of info about Arachnid. But one thing is for sure, she takes pleasure in serving Sentinel without hesitation, which automatically makes her almost as bad as him, especially considering she's aware of everything he's doing. To name just one of those many things, he bows down to the Transformers' arch-nemesis, the Quintessence. They actually have even less information surrounding them than Arachnid, but the little we do have is enough to place them even lower. These guys get the Gluttony Cinder Medal for their sole motivation being to absorb as much energon as they can from the Autobots. Sure, it's a debt for the power they granted Sentinel Prime, so you could argue it's more of a business thing, but it's kind of like arguing that the guys that were gonna shank Aladdin for stealing bread were in the right, just because it was technically legal. But finally, without a shadow of a doubt, the Gold Medal of Evil has to go to Sentinel Prime. Honestly, if there was ever a character who just screamed twist villain, it was Sentinel Prime. At first, I expected him to be secretly enslaving the minor bots to fund his luxurious lifestyle while they thought they were genuinely helping. But it turns out I was mistaken. Sentinel Prime's power was actually a loan from the Quintessence, for which he's being forced to pay back ludicrous amounts of energon in return. Naturally, not wanting to use his own power in effort to do this, he decided to take the transformation cogs of countless Transformers, forcing them to work in the mines all their lives as he lived like a king on the surface. The Greed Cinder Medal will look great next to all the other shiny stuff in this guy's home. Not that he'll be able to enjoy it much after being brutally ripped in half. But honestly, while Megatron was definitely a villain at that point, I can't say I feel any semblance of pity for Sentinel. This guy literally handicapped countless people, forcing them to work to fund his own greedy, power-hungry lifestyle. Also, he wouldn't have to lift a finger for himself. On top of all that, he betrayed his own fellow Primes and murdered them in cold blood, making the situation even worse for the Autobots. Today, the truth is whatever we say it is, and that truth is that Sentinel Prime is the most despicably evil character in this movie. Honestly, Megatron's gonna have to work overtime to outdo him.